When I walk the streets of cities like this, Glasgow was the UK's second most important city. Beautiful buildings, beautiful streets, a gorgeous city. It had Red Clydeside in 1919, the uprising to create a Soviet in Scotland. But it was, crushed, of course. When I see cities like this, I think also about the other side of it. There's a phrase from Walter Benjamin: every monument of civilization is also a monument of barbarism. I think of the famines in Bengal, the jute workers in Bengal sending jute to Dundee through the Glasgow port. I think of human beings from Africa enslaved and brought from Ghana to the New World, and all those prophets getting sucked into cities like London and Glasgow. Between 1765 and 1938, the British Isles stole $45 trillion pounds from India, 45 trillion sterling from India. We never got paid for that. When the British left India, when we threw the British out, our literacy rate was 13%. So much for several hundred years of so-called civilization. Meanwhile, our landscapes were destroyed. Coal was foisted on India. You foisted coal on us. You were the ones that came and made us coal dependent. And then you left, and now you dare to condescend to us. When I listen to Boris Johnson, when I listen to people like Joe Biden, when I listen even more to Emmanuel Macron, all I can think of is how condescending you are. You condescended to us 400 years ago. You condescended to us 300 years ago. You condescended to us 200 years ago. You condescended to us 100 years ago. You're condescending to us today. You only know condescension because for you, colonialism isn't something that happened in the past and we defeated you. It's not that. For you, colonialism is a permanent condition. And that permanent condition happens in two ways. There's the permanent condition of the colonial mentality. You want to lecture us. You want to tell us that we are responsible for all the problems because you'll never accept that you're the one principally to blame. You signed the Rio Formula in 1992 on common and differentiated responsibilities. You like the common part. You like the common part. You like to say we're all in this together and so on. We're not in this together. The United States, 4-5% of the world's population, still uses 25% of the world's resources. You outsource production to China, and then you say China is the carbon polluter. China's producing your buckets. China's producing your nuts and bolts. China's producing your phones. Try to produce it in your own countries and see your carbon emissions rise. You love lecturing us because you have a colonial mentality. Then there are colonial structures and institutions. You lend us money, and every time you lend us money, which is our money, every time the International Monetary Fund comes to our societies and they tell us, here's the money we are giving you. No, it's our money. You give us our money back as debt, and then you lecture us about how we should live. It's extraordinary. It's not just a colonial mentality. It's the colonial structures and institutions which reproduce themselves year after year after year. And let me tell you something. The climate justice movement, not clued enough on this. Not clued enough on this. The climate justice movement is a movement that says we're worried about our future. What future? What future? Children in the African continent, in Asia, in Latin America, they don't have a future. They don't have a present. They're not worried about the future. They're worried about their present. Your slogan is, we're worried about the future. What future? That's a middle-class bourgeois Western slogan. You got to be worried about now. 2.7 billion people can't eat now. And you're telling people, reduce your consumption. How does this sound to a child who hasn't eaten in days? You got to clue into this, guys. You got to clue into this. Otherwise, this movement will have no legs in the third world. No legs. Later, I'd like to tell you about the International People's Assembly, a network of 200 political organizations that we're setting up, rooted in the global south. We want to tell you what our issues are, but are you willing to listen?
those questions where you get people wanting to pin a label on 1.4 billion people and a very complicated system, saying, is it capitalist? Is it socialist? What is it? Look, first thing we need to acknowledge is that every single revolution of a socialist kind took place in a poor country, a backward country, a peasant country, whether it's starting with the revolution against the Tsarist Empire, which was largely a peasant country, and so on. Where is the revolution in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, in Canada? None of the advanced industrial countries had a revolution. These countries had to innovate. That's why the Lenin's advance over Marxism was very important, which is why at least the formations I've belonged to are generally Marxist Leninist formations. The idea that you have to seize the opportunity in a colonial context of building a new kind of society. The problem is colonialism prevented the development of capitalist productive forces, prevented the development. You can't wait around in India waiting for the British to develop your productive forces before you can advance to a socialist revolution. So the task became that communists, socialists in these parts of the world, the colonial parts of the world, had to both build the productive forces and socialize social wealth. It was a dual task, very complicated task. From 1949, by the way, at 1949, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had just come out of a war that went from 1937 to 1949. It's one of the longest World War IIs in the world anywhere. Spain had a World War II that also started early, but it ended much earlier than 1949. It had a landscape that had been almost entirely destroyed, when the communists came to government in 1949. So since 1949, the Chinese people at different levels and the leadership of the Chinese government has attempted in a zigzag fashion to both advance the productive forces and socialized production. At certain times, they find they've gone too far towards advancing productive forces. They zigzag back to socializing wealth. Right now, under Xi Jinping, they are trying to move more of a social agenda, abolishment of poverty, and so on. This is a real struggle. I mean, people always feel like they need to climb the highest mountain and condemn countries, saying, you're insufficiently socialist. For God's sake, Vietnam, bombed by the United States with chemical weapons, its agriculture destroyed, struggling to advance the productive forces under immense odds. And then people in the United States sit in the university departments condemning Vietnam, saying, oh, they are not sufficiently socialist. Go build socialism in your own country, man. Let them struggle with their own struggle. And to the point on this, look, you can't socialize poverty, friends. We are not utopian socialists. This is not Fourier and Saint-Simon and so on. We are not utopians. We believe in advancing the material forces. People need to have a certain social wealth in their hands. We don't just want to be abstractly equal, guys. I'm a Marxist. I'm not a utopian. So they have an immensely difficult task ahead of them. This kind of flimsy judgment, is China this, is China that? Relax, guys. Go back and build.
We're now talking about the growth of the Azov battalion and these Nazi groups in Eastern Europe. Listen, after World War II, Katie, after Nuremberg, the United States operated in West Germany, the Bundesrepublic of Germany, hired Nazis, the Gehlen network, a Nazi network, and used the Gehlen network, which was a Nazi network, to become the intelligence network of the Bundesrepublik of Germany. United States did that in West Germany in the 1950s. They basically brought the Nazis in. In Bolivia, the United States, the CIA operated with elites in Bolivia to bring Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, who became the head of Bolivian intelligence services in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. I mean, Che Guevara was taken out by Nazis in Bolivia. And when Evo faced the coup, Evo Morales faced the coup 2019, there were Nazi groups on the streets that the US was cheerleading for. So look in the mirror, guys. You keep saying that, oh, left, right. I don't know, it's called a red-brown something or the other. I find
the alleged red-brown alliance, yeah.
Right, some anti-fascists, they are such heroes pointing out who is a
lefty
Yeah.
who's
Who
actually
is
a
a real
fascist.
leftist? Who's a tankie? Everyone's a tankie. Who's
Right.
anyone who
Let
opposes
me-
like regime change is a tankie. Apparently.
Right. Let me have you go and explore the deep roots of the United States rehabilitation of Nazis after the war, the impact this is having on Europe today. On Europe today. The Azovs didn't come from nowhere. You know, there was a history of incubating these far right forces, which needs to be looked at. And the United States, the CIA plays a huge role in all this. The United States, the NATO countries, and the near NATO allies, Korea and Japan, you put them all together, they account for 75% of global military spending. This is at a scale that is much larger than anything in the previous phases of modern imperialism. This is nothing like what it was in 1916. It would not be recognizable to Lenin. 75%. The West, controlling a lot of communications channel, argues China is a threat. China's share of global military spending is 10%. 75% over here, 10% over here. It's a ridiculous divergence. There are actual so-called leftists around the world who talk about inter-imperialist conflict between Russia, China, United States. They have lost their mind. They don't understand the actual facts of the situation. In fact, in our argument in this text, China and Russia are defensive powers. These are not aggressive powers. There is only one aggressive core in this period, and that is the United States-led core. It is hyper-imperialism because there's a kinetic character to it. It's kinetic. There is an understanding that the whole world is nails and you have the biggest hammer. There is no attempt to go out there and do development projects. The United States doesn't have the funds for it. Rather than contest the Chinese, for instance, in countries in Africa on commercial terms, they make threats about how China is, a national security threat to Zambia or to Ghana or whatever. The United States has a plethora of military bases on the African continent, but they will say that China is the military threat, but it has no military posture, merely commercial. If you want to contest them commercially, contest them, but they don't have the means. They only have the means to militarize the conflict. So in that sense, it's hyper-imperialist. There's a kinetic character. Every conflict or every sense of political retreat that the United States faces, it militarizes it. And in fact, this has become the case globally, inclusive in Europe. The war in Ukraine, yes, of course, the Russians crossed the line into Ukraine, but this is not a Russian war. This is a war that the United States through NATO provoked, going back to the Maidan, going back to the United States unilateral withdrawal from the mid-range nuclear missile treaty. Unilateral withdrawal. The danger of placing missiles in Taiwan or placing missiles in Ukraine inflames the borders of Russia and China. Inflames those borders. This is a hyper-imperialist conflict imposed on countries like Russia and China. There is no inter-imperialist crisis. So to take Lenin's conjunctural analysis, an analysis born out of a conjuncture, make a general theory out of it, and then take the general theory and plonk it onto our period, is decisively anti-Leninist. You are not honoring Lenin by doing the exact opposite methodologically that Lenin did in 1916 when he put out his pamphlet. He was trying to analyze the conjuncture. You cannot make a general theory out of a conjunctural analysis without mediation. You have to take a conjunctural analysis and build a theory and see if it applies to other conjunctures. Not take an analysis of a conjuncture and pretend that it's a general theory. And I'm surprised to see Marxists of great intelligence missing the very simple point that Lenin's text is a text of a conjuncture. And therefore, we are under an obligation to honor the great Lenin we are under an obligation not to merely repeat Lenin's conjuncture without a detailed analysis of the concrete conditions. Because without a detailed analysis of the concrete conditions, we will not be building theory from the facts. And if you don't build theory from the facts, you will make important strategic and tactical errors. And that is precisely what sectarian sections of the international left have been doing. Not building theory from the facts and therefore making significant strategic, programmatic, strategic, and tactical errors. We honor Lenin by honoring Lenin, not by treating Lenin like a religious god. Lenin was our comrade. Lenin was our comrade. He is a human being. He is with us still in his work, but he's not a god. He is not the 11th avatar. He is a human being. We must build from Lenin, not stay at Lenin.
It's important to clarify what is imperialism, because I mean, it's easy to use that word pejoratively, but what is imperialism? A very quick shorthand, imperialism would imply that your economic system is premised on using internationally extra economic force of one kind or the other, to get your own company's advantages and your own country an advantage. This could be where, a country says, if you don't buy from us, then we're going to use all our diplomatic military force, to sanction you or to somehow make your life miserable. So then you'll end up giving us the contract. Basically that's it. It's more complicated than that, but I think that's a good thumbnail sketch. So let's take the continent of Africa, because this is the most sensitive point of this conversation. In 1885, European countries met in Berlin, and without the presence of any Africans, they divided the continent amongst themselves. Initially, they left small places. They left Morocco, not very small, Morocco, a couple of principalities, Ethiopia. Eventually, they swallowed those up as well, after 1885, in several wars and so on. Only Ethiopia was able to withstand the Italians, but even for a time, its land was conquered. So the whole of the African continent was divided up between European powers, and the United States was also at the meeting. So US plays a role in this, because of course, Sierra Leone, and so on. So let's not be casual about the past. So from roughly the 1880s, when there was this direct colonial intervention, until 1960s, and in some cases 1970s, the Portuguese colonies. So almost for 70, 80 years, the West actually withdrew the sovereignty of African people. And I'm not even going back to the slave trade. Leave all that. I'm just talking about from the 1880s to the 1970s. The West essentially stole the sovereignty of African people and plundered the continent. I mean, the most horrendous is the story in Belgium, obviously, where Leopold essentially wiped out the population in order to make a ton of money. Okay, let's put that on the table. That we know is colonialism. We also know it as imperialism, because after the West, left the African continent, as Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his 1965 book, Neocolonialism, you gave us back political sovereignty, but by then you had made us surrender our economic sovereignty. Till today, French-speaking countries in Africa, Francophone countries, are part of the French franc, and they are reliant. Their profits are basically sitting in French banks. These countries have no economic independence. This is the Francophone countries. If you look at the other kind, like look at the Congo. I mean, it is basically it's a free plunder for big corporations. Glencore, which is registered in Switzerland, is the largest cobalt extractor from the Congo. Cobalt is so essential to batteries and so on. So let's face it, it's basically a lot of European, Australian, Canadian, and American mining companies that continue to plunder the continent. Let's just keep that there. The main companies that are currently exploiting the African continent are from Australia, Canada, the United States, and many European countries, including Switzerland. That's the bulk of the exploitation. China has a very different history in Africa. Initial history was through the kind of socialist Maoist orientation, building the Tanzam Railroad and so on. It had old relations with the government of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania and so on. Very old relationships with this fantastically important person, A.M. Babu, who was eventually in the government of Nyerere, very much a Maoist in his orientation. They welcomed the Chinese into Africa to give them technical assistance and so on in Angola as well. Over the period, Chinese government intervention into Africa has been largely on a state-to-state basis. It's been these kind of projects, over the years. After the 78 reforms, things began to change. Companies began to come and try to bid for projects. Now, this is very important. Chinese firms in the entire continent of Africa, but let's take the case of Zambia as an example. Chinese firms bid for projects. They don't come in and go and see the president of the country and say, if you don't give us the project, we'll withdraw, we'll ask the IMF not to help you with your debt that's coming up, or we'll bomb you or whatever. Until now, let's face it, what evidence we have suggests that Chinese firms, even state-owned firms that come in and bid for contracts, they're bidding on a commercial basis. So what you see is commerce. China's economy has grown rapidly, and a lot of the raw materials that go to China don't go to China. They go through Glencore, cobalt, mined by Glencore, goes to a German company in China where it's manufactured into something and it's sold in the West. China is the territory on which the raw material is processed and manufactured into a good. It's not going to China. Glencore extracts it. Even when a Chinese government company or a Chinese private entity extracts the mineral in Africa, it often goes to European companies or American companies inside China to manufacture. Not always, but often. So let's be clear that this is certainly part of modern capitalism. Zambia has raw materials. In another world, Zambia would not have to sell its raw materials at such low prices. We would like copper not to be sold so cheaply. It's a precious thing. We need to find a way for a country like Zambia to generalize the kind of profits of copper for its population. It's scandalous that in the copper belt region of Zambia, the children who live above that, 60% of them cannot read, who live above the copper. That's because the wealth is taken out and nothing is really given to these people who live right there. This is a point of great criticism. But China is not the responsible party here. The responsible party is capitalism. Capitalism is at fault, and I think one should focus on that. It's convenient that, much of the press attacks China for colonialism in Africa. Come on, guys, let's be serious. There's a long history of real colonialism. This is commerce. I have a problem with capitalism. I even have a problem with some kinds of commerce, but it's not China that's the author here. China is participating in a world system. That's a separate issue. The problem is global capitalism, not China.
So now, capital. So yeah, of course there are 8 people that own everything and, etc. But you see, if you understand capitalism to be embodied in those 8 people, then the execution of 8 people will lead us to socialism. But we know that that's not the case. And we know that's not the case because, Rajat, you talked about how work gives dignity, which I think of as the logic of capital, not the logic of human freedom. I understand the idea that waged employment somehow is making you a person is part of the social relations of capital, from which I want to be liberated. So in that sense, capital is an abstract social force. It's not only vested in the 8 people that are not the only capitalists. They have the ones who have hoarded property, which they have then in such enormous amounts been able to structure political power also to their benefit. But capitalism as a social force is inside our bones, inside our expectations, inside our ambitions. It is, in that sense, it's a virus that runs through the system, that even the most deprived person is underneath the regime and rule of capitalist social relations. In that sense, it's abstract. What I meant is, in the old days, if you go and on a pitchfork put the Lord's head, you might have ended feudalism in that area. You could have created some sort of liberated zone, a slave uprising in Brazil could have created a liberated maroon, and people then created interesting new social relations because they were able to. In our period, even if one country gets rid of the bourgeoisie from power, it is embargoed. We saw that 100 years ago with the Russian Revolution. And right up to the present with the Venezuelans under immense pressure. Whatever their own problems are, they are yet under immense pressure. So in that sense, capital is not vested merely in the... You can run struggles and personalize it, but be careful with what you're doing. Because then you're also pedagogically suggesting the exit of, whatever it is, Adani, whatever is suddenly going to change India. It's not. So that's what I mean. I want to be very particular in understanding capital as this universal social phenomena that we have to tackle and uproot from the root, not from, the branches. So that's what I mean by capital. It's that general social phenomena. See, leisure is a short word that we steal from the 8-hour struggle. It doesn't mean just faffing about. I mean, that's not what leisure means. Leisure has to eclipse work. In other words, we need to construct a world where people work joyfully, not miserably. Tista is quite right. What happens is somebody goes to this BPO, works a miserable job, comes back to a computer, and then it's 3 hours of galis against everybody. I hate you, Muslims have ruined. I mean, that sense of anger, frustration, humiliation is extraordinarily general in our societies. The work is degrading people. Unemployment is degrading people. So let's rethink what it means to reproduce ourselves as a society. It's a much broader challenge. And the left has to be up to that challenge. We cannot allow the right to take the first exit. There are many further exits that we have to imagine. Our imagination has to be much extended. The left is not just the defense of yesterday. It's imagining tomorrow. So we have to think very creatively of what a technologized world is going to look like. Why is it that power currently and property, in other words, capital, power and property being the two legs of capital, how capital has been able to seize technology so that simple technologies like the sewer cleaner, the smokeless chula, the waterless toilet aren't generalized. In Nepal, the biggest killer for women is the chula producing smoke. Now, there are millions of these inventions. But capital has not allowed us to generalize them because the rate of return on generalizing that technology is not as high as making you have a new phone every year. So in that sense, we have to reimagine the whole thing. Not take leisure to mean just walking around on the beach. It means re-understanding what it means to be human and reproduce the world. By the way, if we don't make bold claims, we might as well close down the left. The left isn't about minor adjustments and defending yesterday. The left is about making a bold claim about the future. That's what we're there for. And that's what makes our task so bloody difficult. See, remaining in the present is not allowing us to capture people's imagination. In the last election, for instance, there was a thing, you people don't understand aspiration. What kind of aspiration? Not the aspiration of the present, but we aspire to a different kind of aspiration where people understand to care for each other, to understand each other as being in a society, not that you are less productive than me, therefore I disrespect you. Not that kind of society. Finally, democracy. Democracy. I mean, look, the question is, was there really a democracy? Or was this also not a capitalist dictatorship? I mean, really, was there a democracy? I mean, we talked about, again, just take the sewer as an example. Has caste not completely surrendered Indian democracy? I mean, let's not fantasize about somehow Indian democracy and then Modi ruins everything. I mean, what was the character actually of capitalist democracy? It has great limits. It has great limitations. It is not a generalized universal phenomena. So I don't worry about the destruction of democracy. I worry, are we, again, to pursue the second point, are we imagining what a democratic society should look like? Not let's defend the past or the present. What is a democratic society to look like? Finally, we just published a book by Ambedkar, Ambedkar's unfinished book called India and Communism, in which he makes, I think, the most powerful claim about anti-capitalist movements in India. If caste is not destroyed in India, Ambedkar argued, you will never have communism. That, in other words, anti-caste is as fundamental to the communist movement as any labor struggle by itself, in a narrow way. And I think that is something we should think about. That's about society. What kind of society you want to build, not what kind of factory you want to build. I want to live in a world where we're thinking more about societies in general, not workplaces in particular.
When we, that is the Chinese and Indians, won independence, it's around the midpoint of the 20th century. Today, let's look at the situation. Today, about half the Indian population doesn't know when its next meal is coming. I mean, India has probably one of the highest rates of hunger in the world. And we're talking about 1.2 billion people. That's twice the population of the United States is starving inside India. Just to give you a sense. In the last decades, the Chinese government has lifted that population between 7 and 800 million people out of poverty. So let's pause. In India, which took the capitalist road, 1 in 2 Indians struggles with starvation. In China, which took the socialist road, starvation is not something that they have to deal with. It's not a big problem there. Homelessness is not a big problem. I'm just talking about basic needs. I mean, I know other people will say, what about this? What about that? I'm sticking to the essentials. For me, hunger is the irreducible. A government that cannot abolish hunger is not a government. The United States government, to my mind, Jody, is not a government. It is a shame that in this such a rich country, you have endemic hunger and increasing. You have terrible problem with hunger in the United States. You know, I don't know, I saw some numbers, 35%. This is an abomination. Los Angeles, you know, rich city, so many homeless people. How can you have such wealth and have people hungry and without shelter? That's, to me, the bare irreducible minimum. You can talk, you want to talk about other things. You know, I always tell people, ask me, what do you think of what's happening in Xinjiang? What do you think of Hong Kong? What do you think of this? And my feeling is we'll get to that. But first, let's talk about hunger. And let me talk personally, because I'm from India. If 1 in 2 Indians could get out of hunger the way it is now, it would be amazing. And the Chinese did it. And so when we look at India and China, that's the only thing I want to focus on, frankly. I'm not evading the other things, but I want to focus on that because they were able to eradicate hunger. That is amazing by every indicator. In other words, the United Nations, all of the UN agencies have accepted the numbers of those lifted up from poverty in the last 3 decades. None of them challenge the numbers. Nobody says it's cooked. And when you visit China, and I don't just mean Shanghai, Beijing, and so on, when you go inside the interior, you see the quality of basic life has increased. This is not the same in India, and you don't have to go outside the city to see poverty in India. You can remain in Delhi, the capital city. Forget remain in Delhi. You can remain within 10-minute walk of the Prime Minister's house and you will see wretched poverty. You will see children begging on the street. I've never seen this in China, and it's not because the Chinese government keeps the poor outside the city in some concentration camp. Nonsense. It just doesn't exist anymore because they've tackled it. So to me, Jody, that's the essence of the question of what have the Chinese got, what have they done? If you look from the eyes of a hungry child in India, China is a miracle. If you want to compare China to the United States, that's a whole other different thing. You got to compare like to like. Compare India to China. It's a stunning variation in path.
Vijay, so the first question that I have for you is a burning question that's on everyone's mind. What is a tankie?
Oh, well, I see. What is a tankie? It's great to be with you. This is one of my favorite podcasts. It's not a tankie podcast. I don't even know really why we would play with the term. The term has a funny origin, and I actually hadn't heard this term in many years. It made a return just a few years ago, I think, when a certain section of, particularly in the West, a certain section of social media opinion started to attack people who seemed to be in favor of the Cuban Revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela, people who were with Evo Morales at the time when the coup was happening, people like that, that is to say, people like you and I, began to be called tankies. This is a term that comes from 1956, certainly before you were born, and yes, even before I was born. That's when Soviet tanks entered Hungary. And the question lay before the international left in 1956, do you support the Soviet intervention or not? Those who supported the Soviet intervention were disparagingly called tankies. Now, if you know anything about 1956 and if you know anything about Hungary, you might want to reconsider not supporting the Soviet intervention, because that was one of the most fascistic countries, perhaps had a society more fascistic than Nazi Germany. And so, whatever socialist project was at work in Hungary in 1956 was being threatened not by liberalism or democracy, but by fascism. It's a very different situation in 1968 when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. Then it was a question of reform, more liberal reform. It was not fascism. But 1956, pretty straightforward situation. That term, tankie, those who support the Soviet tanks entering Hungary, was resurrected, it seems to me, just in the last few years. And it's a creature of social media. I mean, I have never in my life actually been called a tankie to my face. But I do regularly get called tankie, especially on Twitter. This is more a Twitter phenomena, where people have all kinds of pseudonyms, and half the people who seem to call me tankie have accounts that, to my mind, seem like CIA bot accounts. But how am I supposed to know? I haven't read the internal documents from Twitter. I have seen the leaked document from Facebook, which confirms that there's an enormous number of Miami-based troll armies that have been managing accounts regarding Honduras, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on. Yes, we know they're on Facebook. They must be on Twitter, and they're the ones who call you a tankie.
Well, I also find it just fascinating because it came out in a time when the fact is that the people with the tanks and the guns were actually supporting the coup, and those who didn't have the tanks and didn't have the guns were against a coup, specifically against, Evo Morales. But in other places, like, the Honduran elections are underway as we talk right now, and we know that the United States backed a military coup there. We know that the United States has backed, several coup attempts in places like Venezuela. I mean, you wrote a book about this. And so in reality, when they're saying tanky, I would just find it funny because it's like, who has the tanks and who has the bullets? It's definitely not the people who are struggling for, social democracy or struggling for socialism. It's definitely the people in the imperialist core who are, repeating CIA talking points, who those talking points aren't innocent, but they are often betrust by the barrel of, a tank gun or the barrel of a gun itself. And so I always just find that really fascinating. It's the people with no power, so to speak, in terms of military force who are being relabeled. It's the colonial turn, it's like all of a sudden self-defense looks, like violence or becomes aggression. And then invasion itself or colonialism becomes a form of self-defense. So I always find that like a very bizarre term, but it does have this historical origin, which I think is important.
In light of the United States' shall we call them, misadventures I know that's an understatement, but in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan, as you work it out in your book with Chomsky, are we, in your judgment, living at a time when it is appropriate to say that there is a decline in the U.S. empire? And by that, I mean something at least roughly comparable to what we mean when we talk about the decline of the British or the Roman or the Greek empires. Do you see it that way? How do you understand the broader implications of what you yourself have written about?
There has been a decline in economic power, as you have also been talking about. there's been a decline. And how do we understand that decline? It's not a question of merely, looking at, say, GDP growth. It's not a question of looking at the size of the economy. It's about forecasting the future of the economy. The United States has found in the last 10 or so years that in very many areas of economic activity, whether it's robotics, high-speed rail, whether it's telecommunications, or indeed computer technology, the Chinese have leapfrogged in many spheres over US and European companies. This is an existential threat to US capitalism, which has come to rely on collecting rents on a number of these areas of human life, particularly telecommunications. There is a fragility, certainly on display, when the United States decides that rather than compete with China strictly on commercial grounds, you're threatened by Huawei, make better phones, make cheaper and better phones than Huawei. Rather than compete on strictly commercial lines, the United States is using military force, diplomatic force, and so on to try to get China to surrender its advances. In that sense, I feel that there has been depletion of power. I think it's too much to say that the world merely repeats old stories, that what happened to the Romans or what happened to the British is going to happen to the United States. History doesn't function like that. We're in a different phase. We need to look the present in the eye, perhaps look at analogies from the past, but not be too analogical in our approach. But if we look history in the eye now, what we see is a depletion of economic power in particular, and the United States substituting military force for economic power. And that is an extraordinarily dangerous situation. In 1973, there was the government of Muhammad Dawood in Afghanistan. Muhammad Dawood was the prime minister for many years. He was himself a liberal aristocrat, and had worked very closely with the left to advance a progressive agenda in Afghanistan. You may know that in the 1964 constitution was the first time they allowed elections in Afghanistan. There were 4 women in the parliament in 1965. One of them, a close friend of mine, communist leader Anahita Ratebzad. All of them worked to push a kind of progressive agenda in Afghanistan. Muhammad Dawood was the prime minister in 73. He took over as the head of government. And he decided that the obstacles to advancing progress had to be basically, dispatched. And so he went after the group of Islamists, particularly their leader, Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was a professor of theology at Kabul University, and his lieutenants, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud. And the government went after these people, and they fled to Pakistan, to Peshawar, where they were heavily funded by the Saudis. The Saudi oil money had flown in 1973 at the same time. Saudis started to fund people like this. And they, from Pakistan, Peshawar, set up a whole set of institutions to bring in so-called refugees. So-called refugees because these were their Jamaati Islami people coming across the border. They trained them. Later, the United States got involved. And they were actually trying to undermine the liberal government of Muhammad Dawood. Later, when the communists took power in 1978, in April, about 18,000 literacy workers went out into the rural areas in a mass literacy campaign. Literacy rate in Afghanistan was about 18%, pretty low, and so that was the high point of the communist agenda. Burhanuddin Rabbani and his gang sent their thugs across the border to start killing these literacy workers. That was one of the first things they did. The government inside Kabul was in a terrible factional struggle between various Hafizullah Amin and Tariqi on one side, Baba Kamal and Anahita Ratebzad on the other, and so on. There was a faction fight. When Kamal prevailed finally, and Amin and Tariqi were dispatched, both killed, in terrible faction fighting, when Kamal prevailed, he found that these people in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, now Pakistan with a right-wing military dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq, were very aggressive coming across the border to kill people. And it's at that point that Kamal requested Soviet help. The Soviets in the Politburo debated this for months, didn't want to come across the border.
This is all now revealed as the Soviet Politburo notes have been released. They didn't want to come. Eventually they came, and the reason they came was they were afraid of two repeats. The repeat of Indonesia, 1965. By the way, today is the 30th of September. On the 30th of September 1965, the coup of Suharto against the Sukarno government led to the killing of 1 million communists in Indonesia. Today is the anniversary. And they also worried about what had happened recently in Chile in 1973 with the killing of the communists around Salvador Allende and the coup by Pinochet. So motivated by Indonesia and by Chile, the Soviets eventually sent troops across the border. They really didn't want to be there. I mean, Andropov and co were very unhappy with this move. They knew from the experience of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on that this would look very bad around the world. And they didn't want it. They wanted the Afghans to deal with this by themselves. So it's a very interesting story, my friends, but it takes us away from our topic a little bit.
Well, but it doesn't because the attempt to overthrow the the Bolshevik revolution has been ongoing virtually since the revolution existed, and this was just another attempt to do that, covered up by all kinds of things that you've been talking about brilliantly as usual. But that's the motive undergirding this whole operation in Afghanistan. And one of the things that happened was people were being told for 16 years that the US was going to leave. And they kept staying because it was a job. And as long as the job was there, the people needed to stay there. Now we're finding out, after all the accusations about the evacuation, that the people were under a threat that if they didn't leave, the armies there, what do you call the people that were going to kill them all? So it's not as though Biden was being, I hate to defend Biden, but not as though he was being foolish in what he did. He got so many people out of the way of being murdered by the insurgents on the other side.
War itself is a crime. War itself is a crime. We shouldn't be talking about war crimes. War is a crime. And the biggest crime is the war on the poor. 2.7 billion people can't eat today. And that's considered something invisible. Where is the outrage in the world when children struggle to eat? 97% of the population of Afghanistan is living in poverty. And there's no urgent Security Council meeting about that. The children who'll die in Afghanistan are irrelevant. Today, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of Ukraine, and others have talked about how horrible it is that this war is taking place in Europe, as if that itself should qualify anything. As if because it's happening in Europe, it's more important than the war in Syria or the war against the Palestinians or the war in Yemen. Somehow, because this is in Europe, old racism rears its head. And this war, these bodies somehow become much more important to focus upon than the bodies of those children who die around the world because they can't eat, or the bodies of the Yemenis who continue to be punctually bombed, not just by the Saudis, but by British and US arms manufacturers, BAE Systems, Lockheed, and others. War is a crime. Yes. Rosa Luxemburg put it beautifully. She said, in peacetime, workers of the world unite. In wartime, workers of each country slit each other's throats. War is never good for the poor. War is never good for workers. War itself is a crime. War is a crime. War produces crimes. Look, we know what was done to Afghanistan was an abomination. There was no good war, Afghanistan, bad war, Iraq. The Afghanistan war was a terrible war. The United States had ample opportunity to negotiate with the Taliban to get bin Laden and others and start a reasonable judicial inquiry about what happened.
They didn't bother. They went and started bombing immediately because they don't care about the Afghan people at all. They don't care about the Afghan people. They don't care about any of the people they brought to Guantanamo. As Mamadou said quite correctly, they can be sanctimonious about what's happening elsewhere in China and so on, but they don't recognize the same principles against themselves. Yes, Guantanamo, 20 years, but what about Abu Ghraib? Have we forgotten so quickly? What about all the other black sites, including in some of these Eastern European countries that are now barking about human rights? Let's ask the Polish government, how many black sites did you have there? How many CIA planes flew through Ireland to Eastern Europe, bringing people to be tortured? Where are they? Where are their stories? Irrelevant in our imagination today. War produces crimes. It's not only itself a crime, it produces crimes. War also produces lies, denials. United States government lied from the first day about everything it was doing in Afghanistan and subsequently in Iraq. They lied about what they were doing. They lied about what happened in 2007 in New Baghdad city when Saeed and Nur el-Din were killed by those Apache helicopters. They lied. They were asked directly. David Finkel of the Washington Post said in his book, he said that there's a video, and the US government lied and said there's no video. It is thanks to Chelsea Manning, the bravery of Chelsea Manning, the honor of Chelsea Manning, that Chelsea Manning downloaded that video, downloaded the material from the State Department, delivered that material to the WikiLeaks organization. It is thanks to Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks organization that we as journalists were able to write about it, that we were able to see the collateral murder video about the cold-blooded murder of Saeed, Nur el-Din and others in New Baghdad city in 2007. It's thanks to them that we were able to finally not sound crazy and be able to tell our editors that this is exactly what we are seeing on the ground. Because for years, editors said, you can't confirm these things. Well, now we could. Now we could, and thanks to the State Department cables, we could confirm even more, not just from Iraq, not just from Afghanistan, but also about the black sites, all confirmed. We could confirm what was happening in the prisons of Egypt, where again prisoners were sent to be tortured, so-called curveball, the reason that the United States decided they could have an excuse to go to war, and an illegal war against the Iraqi people. War produces lies. It's thanks to WikiLeaks, it's thanks to Julian Assange that we were able to break the barrier, break the lies, and show what was actually happening. War is a crime, my friends. War itself is a crime. Of course, Guantanamo must be shut down. Who in their right mind can make an argument to continue Guantanamo, keep the 39 people? As Nancy said, most of them already cleared for release. Of course, shut down Guantanamo. That's hardly a controversial statement. Of course, free Julian Assange. How is that controversial? What did Julian Assange do that the New York Times didn't do? What did Julian Assange do that the Guardian newspaper, and to the shame of the New York Times, to the shame of the Guardian, to the shame of Der Spiegel, none of them stand with the man who provided them the information that came to him from Chelsea Manning. He is going to be charged on that Espionage Act. He should be walking into this room right now to stand here, join us, and tell us about the mechanism WikiLeaks created so that people could come in, provide information anonymously, so that we as journalists could read that information, evaluate whether it's real, and publish it. It was the New York Times that published the material that Chelsea Manning provided to the WikiLeaks organization. Where is the New York Times today? Why isn't it in this room? Why don't they cover the Belmarsh Tribunal? They will not. Obviously, shut down Guantanamo. Obviously, free Julian Assange. Today, my friends, the whistleblowers are in prison. The war criminals win awards. The whistleblowers are in prison and the war criminals win awards. War is a crime. It's up to us to stop this abomination from continuing.
I'm just saying that the question of, if somebody in the West says to me, well, China, they're just a capitalist country. Well, you're entitled to your ill-informed opinion. But before you give that opinion, can you name for me, two important debates that have taken place in Chinese society over the last 3 years? Do you know the names of 5 people in China who write about poverty? Do you know what kind of poverty schemes there are? And now with COVID-19, why has the Chinese government and Chinese public actions, very key, socialism, not about the state alone. It's about neighborhood committees. It's about organizations, associations. Why is their reaction so different? How is it that in one district, 440,000 people volunteered? In advanced industrial countries, people don't know how to volunteer. You get 6 people doing mutual aid. That's brilliant, beautiful. It's sensitive people who are out there feeding the homeless and so on. But 440,000 people volunteering in Kerala, 4.5 million women out of 17 million are in a cooperative called Kudumbushri. They are out there feeding people, making masks, hand sanitizer. I mean, we need to, if you really question, what's socialism in Kerala? Look at the quality of public action. What's socialism in China? Look at the quality of public action, the neighborhood committees, the volunteering. I mean, that the Communist Party, you may have seen the video of the doctors opening their masks, and they were standing in a line. It's a charming video. One by one, they opened them, like ballet dancers, in a row or whatever. If you look carefully, each one of them had the Communist Party lapel on. They were all Communist Party members. Now, the thing is that the party instructed their doctors, said, look, we prefer that you go there because you've made a commitment to serve the people. If there are non-communist doctors who want to be there, they can be there. But if they want to leave, they're willing to leave. We will substitute with you because you are committed to serve the people. That's public action. The state didn't tell them to go there, by the way. This is the Communist Party. Now, I know some people will say the Communist Party is state identical. It's not true. It is not true. It's not identical. There are institutions in Chinese society which are outside the Communist Party. Well, I don't know about the white fragility thing because, I actually didn't know who he was until fairly recently, maybe a year ago. I'm talking about Jordan Peterson. I was somebody sent me a link and I watched him talk and started crying and so on. But he was crying at all odd moments, I thought, like where I couldn't understand why he was crying. And, I felt this man really needs some sort of a hug. Because like he's crying at all, like he kept saying, Marxism is something, and he started crying. And I thought, Marxism is a group of professors near you in Canada. In Canada, it's hardly like some major threat. It's just a group of professors. Most of them drive Subarus and wear Birkenstocks and whatever. Take it easy, man. Why are you crying about that? If you want to cry in Canada, cry about the excessive death of Native women. That's something worth crying about, dude. Not like some abstract thing called cultural Marxism. Take it easy. Very weird. This whole world has become quite odd, in these matters.
The Soviet Union didn't collapse in and of itself. It was politically assassinated. It was closed down in 1991. From that period onward, the United States attempted, in a way, the ambition of controlling the whole world, first among equals, blah, 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 primus inter pares. Attempted, I say, because it didn't succeed. It wasn't able to succeed. Even in that period, there were always what it called rogue states. The DPRK on the Korean Peninsula, Iran, Syria, etc. Countries that just were not willing to submit to the United States. Rogue states, Cuba, then the emergence in South America of the Bolivarian Project, Venezuela, the Nicaraguans strengthened, unwilling to submit, and so on. But this third period of what sometimes is called US unipolarity is a period of great imperial overreach. This is a term from bourgeois writers, imperial overreach, not from us. But it's correct. United States, for instance, starts escalating military spending and basically cuts down its tax system so that it doesn't, in fact, produce a system where it's able to use wealth, use its considerable wealth to build a strategic domination of the world. In fact, the domination of the world becomes mostly military and not so much by building projects to assist even the bourgeoisie in the global south. Partly because it's said to its own elites, you don't need to pay taxes. You can offshore your money and whatever remains of its resources put into the military in order to vanquish those rogue states, those holdouts. Enormous military spending to tackle them, to prevent new rivals from emerging, and so on. All of that jettisons capitalism into the Third Great Depression. Why the Third Great Depression? The First Great Depression, global depression, late 19th century. The spur of all three depressions is in the United States. It's interesting. It's a railway bust in the late 19th century. Second Great Depression, the Wall Street collapse, 1929. That depression goes from 29 till about 1945. It's through military spending that the United States recovers its immense economic growth in the so-called Golden Age. But the Third Great Depression takes place due to the housing market collapse in the US, from which capitalist economies have not recovered. Latest study from the IMF shows that. In fact, they talk about this non-stop austerity program, that the only reason money remains sound is because of austerity. Living standards have declined one way or the other. It's not just the COVID pandemic, or it's not just the war in Ukraine. It's a long-term problem that goes back to the start of the second decade of this century. So from the Third Great Depression onward, we've entered a new phase. What is this new phase of imperialism? You see, I want to stop for a second and say, is it heretical? Is it heretical to say that there are four conjunctural moments? Is it anti-Leninist to say there are four conjunctural moments? I don't think so. I think, in fact, from Lenin's perspective, these conjunctural analyses of each of the moments is precisely the method of Marxism, Leninism. It's precisely the method. Lenin was a great contributor to the importance of the conjunctural analysis. You see that in a lot of his writings. So what is the nature of the conjuncture from the Third Great Depression's inauguration onwards? It's interesting to look at that, because it's from around that period that you see Russia and China emerge as major powers, but not alone. India's economy starts to grow. Indonesia, Nigeria. Right now the IMF has said Nigeria slipped to the fourth largest economy in Africa. That's only because of currency devaluation. In fact, Nigeria's economy remains quite big. That doesn't mean they've dealt with inequality in any of these countries, but the economies are growing, which is unlike the situation in the West, the epicenter of the Third Great Depression. So from this period onwards, the global North has come to understand that it is losing that control that it's had for hundreds of years. And therefore, it is putting more eggs into the basket of the military than less. It is militarizing all of diplomacy. Unable to build bridges, it wants to blow them up or threaten to blow them up. That's a key point. In this text, Hyper-Imperialism, we demonstrate that world military spending, today SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute, released their report. They say, oh, world military spending up to 2 trillion. They have been under pressure to up their numbers because it's hugely deflated. We show, looking at the numbers closely, that US military spending by itself is not 900 billion, as SIPRI says, but 1.53 trillion, because we've added in nuclear spending.